Airport security insisted my medication was contraband. Then they saw my DEA badge. The TSA agent's hand was already reaching for her radio when I realized this wasn't a routine check. She'd pulled my prescription bottle from the clear plastic bag, held it up to the fluorescent lights like she'd discovered cocaine in a baby's diaper, and her expression had shifted from bored professionalism to something that looked almost triumphant. "Sir, I need you to step aside," she said, her voice loud enough that every passenger in the security line turned to stare. My laptop was still in the gray bin, my belt was in another, my shoes were somewhere behind me, and I was standing there in my socks, watching this woman treat my legally prescribed medication like I'd tried to smuggle a weapon onto a plane. The bottle was labeled clearly. My name, the prescribing physician, the pharmacy, the dosage, everything required by law. But none of that seemed to matter to TSA Officer K. Brennan, whose name tag sat crooked on her navy blue uniform as she called over her supervisor with the kind of urgency usually reserved for actual threats. I'd been a special agent with the Drug Enforcement Administration for 11 years when this happened. 11 years of undercover operations, controlled buys, surveillance operations that lasted weeks, testifying in federal court about drug trafficking organizations that moved millions in narcotics across state lines. I'd been shot at twice, had my cover nearly blown in Detroit, spent 3 months living as someone else to infiltrate a fentanyl distribution network. I knew every federal regulation about controlled substances, had memorized the scheduling classifications, could recite the legal requirements for prescription documentation in my sleep. The irony of being detained for legally prescribed medication while carrying credentials that gave me authority to investigate drug crimes wasn't lost on me. But standing there at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport at 6:45 on a Thursday morning, watching Officer Brennan's supervisor approach with that same predatory expression, I understood this wasn't about regulations or safety. This was something else entirely. The supervisor was a man in his early 50s, ID badge reading D. Whitfield, Supervisory TSA Officer, with 15 years of service pins on his collar and eyes that didn't quite meet mine when he picked up my prescription bottle. He turned it over slowly, reading the label with exaggerated care, like he was examining evidence at a crime scene, instead of looking at a legitimate prescription for oxycodone that I'd been taking for 6 years following a spinal injury from a car accident during a pursuit. "Mr. Foster, this is a controlled substance," he said, his tone suggesting I was either stupid or lying. "Do you have documentation for this medication?" I pointed to the doctor's letter in the clear bag next to the bottle, the one I'd been carrying for years specifically for situations like this, though I'd never actually needed it before. The letter was from Dr. Leonard Rourke, orthopedic surgeon at Georgetown University Hospital, explaining my injury, my treatment plan, and confirming that I was prescribed 30 milligrams of oxycodone daily for chronic pain management related to herniated discs at L4 and L5. Whitfield picked up the letter, unfolded it with theatrical slowness, and barely glanced at it before shaking his head. "This doesn't look legitimate," he said, and my stomach dropped, not because I was worried about the documentation, which was absolutely legitimate, but because I recognized what was happening. I'd seen this performance before, but from the other side. The deliberate misreading of obvious facts, the manufacturing of suspicion where none existed, the power play designed to intimidate and control. I'd watched drug dealers try this exact routine when confronted with evidence, playing dumb and stalling for time while they figured out their next move. "The letter is from a licensed physician at a major university hospital," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "The prescription bottle has all required information. I'm in compliance with TSA regulations for traveling with medication. What exactly is the problem?" Brennan stepped closer, invading my space in a way that was clearly meant to be intimidating. "The problem is, we have reason to believe this medication may not be legitimately prescribed. We're going to need to verify this with your doctor and the pharmacy. That's going to take some time." She glanced at the departure board visible through the security checkpoint. "Looks like your flight board's in 35 minutes. You're probably going to miss it." The threat was clear. Comply, be humiliated, miss my flight, or face something worse. I pulled out my phone to call my doctor's office, and Whitfield immediately objected. "You can't use your phone in the secure area, sir. You'll need to step back through the checkpoint," which would mean collecting all my belongings, getting redressed, going back through security after this was resolved, and definitely missing my flight to Atlanta, where I was supposed to testify in a federal drug trafficking case at 9:30 that morning. The defendants were members of a Mexican cartel distribution cell that had moved over 200 kilograms of methamphetamine through the southeastern United States. My testimony was critical to establishing the chain of custody for intercepted communications. Missing that appearance could derail months of investigative work. I'd been managing chronic pain for 6 years, ever since the accident that had nearly ended my career. It happened during a vehicle pursuit in Northern Virginia, chasing a suspect who'd fled after a controlled buy of heroin went sideways. The suspect ran a red light at 60 miles per hour, I followed, and a pickup truck T-boned my unmarked sedan on the driver's side. The impact compressed my spine, herniated 2 discs, and left me with nerve damage that caused constant pain radiating down my left leg. I'd spent 4 months in physical therapy, tried every non-opioid pain management option available, but nothing worked well enough to let me do my job. Dr. Rourke had been reluctant to prescribe oxycodone long-term, spent 2 appointments explaining the risks and alternatives, but eventually agreed when it became clear I couldn't function without it. I took my medication exactly as prescribed, never increased the dose without consulting my doctor, submitted to random drug tests as required by DEA policy for agents on prescription opioids, and maintained documentation that would satisfy the most paranoid compliance officer. The medication had given me my life back. Let me return to full duty, work cases, travel for investigations and court appearances. I'd testified dozens of times since returning to work, traveled through probably 30 different airports, and never once had anyone question my prescription. The bottle was properly labeled, always in my carry-on, always in the clear plastic bag with my doctor's letter. I followed every rule, checked TSA guidelines before every trip, made sure my prescription never expired before travel dates. And now I was being detained by 2 TSA officers who were either incompetent or running some kind of scam, and I couldn't figure out which. Whitfield had walked away with my medication and the letter, supposedly to make phone calls, leaving Brennan to stand guard over me like I was a criminal. Other passengers were being waved through security, giving me sideways glances, clearly wondering what I'd done. The humiliation was intentional, designed to make me compliant, to make me accept whatever they decided. I'd spent enough years in law enforcement to recognize a shakedown when I saw one. The overly aggressive response to a routine situation, the refusal to accept obvious documentation, the manufactured urgency and threats, the way Whitfield had taken my medication out of my sight, breaking chain of custody protocols that would make the evidence inadmissible if this were an actual enforcement action. Something was wrong here, and it wasn't my prescription. I thought about identifying myself as a federal agent, but something made me hesitate. If this was just incompetence or overzealous security theater, pulling out my credentials would solve it immediately. But if this was something else, if Whitfield and Brennan were running some kind of operation, showing my DEA badge might escalate the situation in ways I couldn't predict. I needed more information before making that move. "How long is this verification going to take?" I asked Brennan. She shrugged with elaborate indifference. "However long it takes. We take drug smuggling very seriously." Drug smuggling. As if someone trying to smuggle oxycodone would carry it in a properly labeled prescription bottle with a doctor's letter. Whitfield returned 15 minutes later, and his expression had shifted from suspicious to openly hostile. "I called the pharmacy number on the label. They have no record of this prescription." The lie was so blatant, I almost laughed. "That's impossible. I filled this prescription 8 days ago at Walton Pharmacy in Arlington, Virginia. The pharmacist was Linda Cho. The prescription number is printed on the label. What number did you call?" He held up a notepad where he'd written a number that was definitely not the pharmacy's number. It wasn't even the right area code. "This is the number printed on your bottle," he said, showing me the label where the actual pharmacy number was clearly visible and completely different from what he'd written down. He deliberately called the wrong number, documented it, and was now using that manufactured discrepancy as evidence that my prescription was fake. The scheme was becoming clearer. They were going to confiscate my medication, claim it was contraband, and there would be no record of it because the whole interaction was off book. "That's not the number on the bottle," I said, pointing to the actual pharmacy number. "You wrote down the wrong number. If you call the actual pharmacy number, they'll confirm the prescription." Whitfield's jaw tightened. "Are you calling me a liar?" The question was aggressive, designed to provoke a reaction that would justify escalating the situation. I'd seen suspects use the same tactic, trying to bait law enforcement into losing their temper so they could claim mistreatment. "I'm saying you wrote down the wrong number. It happens. Let's call the right number and resolve this." Brennan cut in before Whitfield could respond. "Sir, we're going to need to confiscate this medication and file a report with local law enforcement. You're going to miss your flight. I suggest you collect your belongings and contact the airline about rebooking." She was holding my prescription bottle, and I noticed her hand had moved toward her pocket. She was going to take my medication, and once it was gone, I'd have no proof it had ever been properly prescribed. No evidence of what they'd done. Just my word against theirs, and they had the uniforms and the authority. I'd investigated corrupt law enforcement before. DEA agents who skimmed drugs from evidence, police officers who resold confiscated narcotics, entire departments that ran protection rackets for dealers. The patterns were always the same. Abuse of authority, manufactured probable cause, evidence that disappeared without proper documentation. And the victims were always people who couldn't fight back effectively, people who didn't have the resources or knowledge to challenge the system. Travelers were perfect targets. Transient, pressured by time, unlikely to file complaints or follow up. Confiscate their medication, file some paperwork that went nowhere, and the drugs disappeared into whatever black market these officers were feeding. It was brazen and stupid, but it probably worked because most people didn't know their rights and didn't have the leverage to push back. But I wasn't most people, and I was done playing along with this performance. "Before you confiscate anything," I said, my voice dropping into the tone I used when interviewing suspects, "I need to inform you that I'm a federal law enforcement officer, and that medication is legally prescribed. If you confiscate it without proper cause, you're committing theft under color of authority." The change in the room was immediate. Whitfield's hand froze halfway to his radio. Brennan's fingers tightened around my prescription bottle. Both of them stared at me like I'd just announced I was from Mars. "You're a cop?" Brennan asked, and her voice had lost some of its aggressive edge. "Federal agent, Drug Enforcement Administration, Special Agent David Foster. I've been with DEA for 11 years. That prescription is legitimate, the documentation is legitimate, and what you're doing right now is interfering with a federal officer in the performance of his duties. I kept my hands visible, my body language non-threatening, but my tone made clear this wasn't a request or a negotiation. I'm scheduled to testify in federal court in Atlanta this morning. You've detained me for 25 minutes over a prescription that is clearly legitimate. I need my medication returned, I need to catch my flight, and I need an explanation for why 2 TSA officers deliberately called the wrong pharmacy number to manufacture evidence of wrongdoing. Whitfield recovered faster than Brennan. If you're a federal agent, show me your credentials. He said it like he was calling a bluff, like he expected me to fumble or admit I'd been lying. I reached slowly into my carry-on bag, the one they'd been searching when this started, and pulled out my credential case. Federal agents are required to carry credentials at all times, even when traveling for personal reasons. My case held my DEA badge and identification card, both of which clearly showed my name, photo, and authority as a special agent. I flipped it open and held it up so both officers could see. The badge was gold, the identification card had multiple security features, and the authority was unmistakable. Brennan's face went pale. Whitfield's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something between anger and fear. "You should have identified yourself immediately," he said, and the deflection was so predictable I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I shouldn't have needed to identify myself. My medication is properly prescribed and documented. TSA regulations don't require passengers to identify themselves as law enforcement to travel with legal medication. What they do require is that TSA officers follow proper procedures, which you didn't. I could see Whitfield calculating his options, trying to figure out how to salvage this situation. "There was a miscommunication about the pharmacy number," he said, his tone shifting toward conciliatory. "We take security seriously, and sometimes that means being extra cautious with controlled substances. I apologize for the inconvenience. You're free to proceed to your gate." He held out my prescription bottle like he was doing me a favor instead of returning my property after an illegal detention. I didn't take it immediately. "A miscommunication. You wrote down a number that doesn't match the label, called that wrong number, and then used the resulting 'no record found' to justify confiscating my medication. That's not a miscommunication. That's either incompetence or something worse." Brennan had stepped back, her body language screaming that she wanted to be anywhere else. But Whitfield was committed to the bluff. "Agent Foster, I understand you're frustrated, but this is a routine security matter that got complicated. No harm done. You'll still make your flight if you hurry." The dismissal was calculated. He was counting on me being too focused on making my flight to pursue this further. It was a reasonable gamble. Most people, even law enforcement, would take the win and move on. But I'd spent my career investigating organizations that relied on people not pushing back, on victims being too intimidated or too busy to follow up. And standing there in my socks, watching this TSA supervisor try to sweep his misconduct under the rug, I realized I had a choice. I could take my medication, catch my flight, testify in Atlanta, and let this go. Or I could miss my flight, potentially harm a major prosecution, but expose what looked like a systematic scheme to steal passengers' medications. The decision should have been easy. The case in Atlanta was important, represented months of work by multiple agents. But something about this situation felt bigger than one bad interaction at airport security. "I need to speak to your supervisor," I said. "Right now." Whitfield's jaw clenched. "I am the supervisor on duty. If you want to file a complaint, there's a process for that. You can submit a form online or contact TSA's customer service line." He was stalling, trying to run out the clock until my flight left and the immediate pressure disappeared. I pulled out my phone, ignoring his earlier objection about using it in the secure area, and called my supervisor at DEA. Assistant Special Agent in Charge. Raymond Kovach had been with the agency for 23 years, was currently running the Atlanta Field Division's enforcement group, and had specifically asked me to testify in this morning's trial because I'd been the case agent on the wiretap authorization. He answered on the second ring. "Foster, please tell me you're at the courthouse. I'm still in Dallas. TSA detained me, tried to confiscate my medication, and I think they're running some kind of theft operation. I'm going to miss the flight." The silence on the other end lasted maybe 3 seconds. "Explain." I gave him the quick version while Whitfield and Brennan stood there listening, their expressions shifting as they realized I was bringing in federal law enforcement supervision. Kovach didn't interrupt, just listened, and when I finished, he said, "Put the TSA supervisor on the phone." I handed my phone to Whitfield, who took it reluctantly. I couldn't hear Kovach's side of the conversation, but I watched Whitfield's face go from defensive to pale to something approaching panic over the course of 2 minutes. When he handed the phone back, his hand was shaking slightly. Kovach's voice in my ear was controlled but cold. "I contacted the airport's federal security director. Someone from TSA management will be there in 10 minutes. I also called the U.S. Attorney's office in Dallas. They're sending someone to take a statement. You're going to miss the Atlanta testimony, but we'll work around it. Document everything. And David, if this is what it looks like, don't let it go." The federal security director for DFW Airport was a woman named Judith Carver, early 60s, with 32 years in federal service, and an expression that suggested she'd seen every variety of human stupidity. She arrived with 2 airport police officers and a TSA inspector whose ID showed he was from the Office of Inspection. Carver introduced herself, asked for my credentials, examined them carefully, and then turned to Whitfield with the kind of cold professionalism that made it clear this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. Supervisory Officer Whitfield, explain why you detained a federal agent traveling with properly documented prescription medication. Whitfield tried the same deflection he'd used with me. We had concerns about the legitimacy of the prescription. We followed standard verification procedures. Carver picked up my prescription bottle and the doctor's letter, reading both with obvious familiarity with the regulations. The bottle is properly labeled with the passenger's name, prescribing physician, pharmacy information, and current fill date. The accompanying letter is from a licensed physician at a major hospital explaining the medical necessity and confirming the prescription. What standard procedure required you to verify this? Whitfield fumbled for an answer that wasn't coming. The TSA inspector, whose name was Gerald Northrup and who'd been quietly taking notes since arriving, spoke up. Supervisory Officer Whitfield, what number did you call to verify the prescription? Whitfield showed his notepad where he'd written the wrong number. Northrup compared it to the actual pharmacy number printed on the bottle. These numbers don't match. How did you determine which number to call? It was the question that collapsed Whitfield's entire defense. He couldn't claim he'd called the number on the bottle because the documentation proved otherwise. He couldn't claim it was a transcription error because the numbers were too different. He was trapped by his own paperwork, and everyone in the room could see it. I must have misread the label, he finally said, and the excuse was so weak it barely qualified as an attempt. Carver's expression didn't change, but her tone dropped several degrees. You misread a clearly printed phone number, called the wrong pharmacy, and then used the resulting "no record found" to justify confiscating medication from a federal agent who was carrying proper documentation. Is that your statement? Brennan had been silent through this entire exchange, standing off to the side like she was hoping to become invisible, but Northrup turned to her next. Officer Brennan, you were present during this interaction. Did you verify the phone number Supervisory Officer Whitfield called? She looked at Whitfield, then at Northrup, clearly calculating which answer would hurt her less. I didn't personally verify the number. Supervisory Officer Whitfield handled the verification call. It was a deflection, throwing Whitfield under the bus while trying to maintain deniability. But Northrup wasn't letting her off that easily. Did you have any concerns about the legitimacy of Agent Foster's prescription when you initially identified it during screening? Brennan hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw the calculation. She'd seen the proper label, seen the doctor's letter, and still called over her supervisor. That wasn't random. That was coordinated. The passenger was carrying a controlled substance. We're trained to be cautious with those medications, she said, and it was the kind of answer that sounded reasonable until you thought about it for more than 2 seconds. Carver cut through it. You're trained to verify that controlled substances are properly labeled and documented, which this medication was. You're not trained to confiscate legal medication without cause. What made you believe this prescription wasn't legitimate? Brennan didn't have an answer that wouldn't incriminate her, so she went with silence. Carver turned to the airport police officers who'd been observing quietly. I want both of these officers escorted out of the secure area. They're suspended pending investigation. Inspector Northrup will be conducting interviews, and I expect full cooperation. The airport police moved to flank Whitfield and Brennan, and the power dynamic that had defined this entire interaction reversed completely. Suddenly, they were the ones being detained, the ones being questioned, the ones whose careers were hanging in the balance. Whitfield tried one last appeal. Director Carver, this is an overreaction to a simple miscommunication. We were doing our jobs. Carver's response was immediate and brutal. Your job is to protect aviation security, not to harass federal agents and confiscate legal medication based on fabricated evidence. You'll have an opportunity to explain your actions during the investigation. I collected my belongings, got redressed, and followed Inspector Northrup to a private office where he took my statement. He was methodical and thorough, asking about every detail of the interaction, taking notes on a laptop, occasionally asking me to clarify timeline or exact wording. When I described Whitfield deliberately writing down the wrong pharmacy number and then claiming he'd called the number on the bottle, Northrup stopped typing and looked at me directly. That's not the first time I've heard about that tactic. We've had 3 complaints in the past 6 months about TSA officers confiscating medication from passengers and claiming they couldn't verify prescriptions. None of those passengers followed up because they were traveling and didn't have time to file formal complaints. But if this is a pattern, it's bigger than just 2 officers. He pulled up a database on his computer, ran some searches, and showed me the results. Over the past year, DFW Airport had logged 47 incidents of prescription medication being confiscated from passengers during security screening. That number alone wasn't necessarily suspicious. Large airports process millions of passengers. Some percentage will have issues with medication documentation. But Northrup had filtered the data by officer name. Whitfield appeared in 19 of those 47 incidents. Brennan appeared in 14. They were involved in 70% of all medication confiscations at an airport that employed over 300 TSA officers. The statistical improbability was staggering. That's not random, I said, and Northrup nodded. No, it's not. And it gets worse. None of these confiscated medications made it to proper evidence storage. They should have been logged, secured, and either returned to passengers or destroyed according to federal guidelines. But there's no record of any of this medication in our evidence system. It disappeared. We looked at each other, both of us understanding exactly what that meant. Whitfield and Brennan had been systematically stealing prescription medication from travelers, using their TSA authority to confiscate pills under false pretenses, and the drugs were going somewhere off-book. The scale of it was enormous. 47 incidents over 12 months meant they were hitting roughly 4 passengers a month, maybe more if some victims didn't report it. If each confiscation averaged 30 pills, that was over 1,400 pills disappearing into the black market. "I need to contact our Office of Professional Responsibility," Northrop said, "and probably the FBI. If TSA officers are stealing controlled substances, this is federal theft and potentially drug trafficking." He made several calls while I sat there processing the magnitude of what we'd stumbled into. My missed flight and derailed testimony suddenly felt insignificant compared to a systematic scheme that had been running for months, stealing from vulnerable travelers who were unlikely to fight back. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Dallas sent an assistant U.S. attorney named Patricia Fleming, mid-40s, who'd spent 15 years prosecuting federal crimes and specialized in corruption cases. She interviewed me separately from Northrop, recorded my statement, asked pointed questions about Whitfield's deliberate misreading of the pharmacy number and Brennan's coordinated response. "The threshold question is whether this is just theft or something bigger," she said when we'd finished the statement. "If they're reselling these medications, that's drug trafficking. If they're working with someone outside TSA, that's conspiracy. Either way, we're looking at federal felonies with significant prison time." Fleming coordinated with Inspector Northrop and Director Carver to secure Whitfield and Brennan's work lockers, computers, and personal effects before they had a chance to destroy evidence. The search required a warrant, which Fleming obtained from a federal magistrate within 2 hours by presenting my statement and the statistical analysis showing the pattern of confiscations. When TSA investigators opened Whitfield's locker at 4:30 that afternoon, they found 83 prescription pills in an unmarked plastic bag hidden inside a lunch container. Chemical analysis later confirmed they were oxycodone, hydrocodone, and alprazolam, all controlled substances, none of which Whitfield was prescribed. Brennan's locker contained similar contraband, 47 pills in a zippered pouch inside her purse. Both officers were arrested by FBI agents that evening, charged with theft of government property, drug trafficking, and conspiracy. The initial charges were just the beginning. As federal investigators dug deeper, the scheme expanded in ways that shocked even the prosecutors who'd seen decades of corruption cases. The investigation revealed that Whitfield and Brennan had been working with a pharmacy technician named Dennis Kowalski, who worked at a CVS 3 miles from the airport. Kowalski had access to the pharmacy's prescription database and would help Whitfield verify which medications were most valuable on the black market. When TSA confiscated pills, Whitfield would pass them to Kowalski, who would resell them through a network of buyers he'd cultivated over 5 years working in pharmacy. The operation had generated an estimated $200,000 over 18 months, split 3 ways between the conspirators. They'd targeted travelers specifically because people passing through airports were transient, stressed, and unlikely to file complaints or follow up with authorities. The scheme had worked for over a year because most victims accepted the TSA's authority, took the loss, and moved on. I'd been different because I knew the regulations, recognized the scam, and had the resources to push back. But I kept thinking about all the passengers who hadn't pushed back, who'd lost medication they needed, who'd been victimized by the very people supposed to protect them. The criminal cases moved through the system with the momentum that comes from overwhelming evidence and defendants who started cooperating once they realized the scope of what prosecutors had documented. Kowalski flipped first, providing detailed testimony about the operation in exchange for a reduced sentence. His cooperation led to additional charges and exposed the full extent of the conspiracy. Whitfield and Brennan tried to fight initially, their defense attorneys arguing that this was overzealous prosecution of what amounted to minor theft. But Fleming presented the evidence methodically. Surveillance footage from the airport showing the patterns of who Whitfield and Brennan targeted. Database records proving the medications never made it to evidence. Financial records showing unexplained cash deposits to Kowalski's account that coincided with confiscation dates. Testimony from 12 other travelers who'd had medication confiscated under circumstances identical to mine. The defense collapsed. Both officers pleaded guilty in federal court to conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, theft of property under color of authority, and official misconduct. Whitfield received 9 years in federal prison. Brennan got 7 years. Kowalski received 5 years for his cooperation and testifying against his co-conspirators. All 3 were ordered to pay restitution to identified victims, though recovering money from people about to spend years in prison was largely symbolic. The TSA implemented new procedures at DFW and other airports to prevent similar schemes. Medication confiscations now required supervisor approval, documentation went to a centralized database, and random audits verified that confiscated items made it to proper evidence storage. Director Carver personally oversaw the policy changes and instituted quarterly reviews to catch statistical anomalies that might indicate new problems. Inspector Northrop's office expanded their investigation to other airports and found 2 smaller similar schemes at different facilities, leading to additional arrests and policy reforms across TSA. The case became a training example for what institutional corruption looks like and how to identify patterns that indicate systemic problems rather than isolated incidents. I testified in the Atlanta drug trafficking case 3 weeks later than originally scheduled. The delay complicated the prosecution slightly, but didn't derail it. The defendants were convicted, sentenced to lengthy prison terms, and a significant methamphetamine distribution network was dismantled. My supervisor, Kovacs, was understanding about the missed testimony, especially once he learned about the investigation my detention had triggered. "You cost us 3 weeks on one case but broke open a federal corruption scheme," he said during my performance review. I'd call that a net positive. The chronic pain that had led to me carrying that prescription in the first place continued to be something I managed daily. The medication worked, the injury was permanent, and I'd made peace with the reality that I'd probably be dealing with this for the rest of my career. But I'd also learned something about vulnerability and power that changed how I approached my work. Every person I'd ever arrested, every suspect I'd interviewed, every witness I'd questioned, they'd all been navigating systems they didn't fully control, dealing with people who had authority over them, trying to assert their rights while facing institutional pressure. 6 months after my detention at DFW Airport, I received a letter from a woman named Dorothy Hillman, who'd been on the list of Whitfield's victims. She was 73 years old, traveling to visit her daughter, carrying medication for rheumatoid arthritis that had been confiscated by Whitfield using the same playbook he'd used on me. She'd been too intimidated to fight back, had missed her medication for 3 days until she could get her prescription refilled, and had suffered a painful flare-up of her condition as a result. "I want you to know that what you did mattered," she wrote. "When I saw the news about those TSA officers being arrested, I cried. Not because I got justice, I'm not even getting my medication back, but because someone finally stopped them from doing this to other people. Thank you for not just letting it go." The letter sat on my desk for a week. I read it maybe 20 times, thinking about all the decisions that had led to this outcome. The choice to push back instead of just taking my medication and catching my flight. The decision to involve my supervisor and federal prosecutors. The willingness to miss important testimony, to pursue what looked like corruption. Any of those decisions could have gone differently. I could have let it go, rationalized that making my flight was more important than fighting 2 TSA officers over a 20-minute detention. I could have accepted Whitfield's attempt to smooth things over and moved on. But something about the brazenness of what they were doing, the calculated way they'd targeted travelers they thought were powerless, had triggered something in me that wouldn't let it slide. Maybe it was 11 years of investigating people who abused power and hurt vulnerable victims. Maybe it was the chronic pain that gave me personal experience with how important medication access was. Maybe it was just stubborn anger at watching institutional authority being weaponized for theft. Whatever the reason, I hadn't let it go, and because of that choice, 3 people were in federal prison, and hundreds of travelers would be protected from similar schemes. The impact felt disproportionate to my role. I'd just been trying to catch a flight to testify in a case. But sometimes justice comes from people refusing to accept injustice as inevitable, from someone with knowledge and resources choosing to use them when they see something wrong. A year after the arrests, I was back at DFW Airport for another flight, this time to Los Angeles for a multi-agency task force meeting about fentanyl trafficking. I went through security with my medication in the clear plastic bag, properly labeled and documented like always. The TSA officer who checked it examined the bottle, checked the label against my ID, and waved me through without comment. The entire interaction took maybe 15 seconds. Normal, professional, exactly how it should work. As I collected my belongings and headed toward my gate, I thought about how many people had passed through this checkpoint in the past year, carrying medication they needed, not knowing that the reforms protecting them had come from one delayed flight and one federal agent who'd refused to accept abuse of authority. The truth is that most institutional change comes from unglamorous moments, not dramatic confrontations or cinematic showdowns, but from people doing the boring work of documentation, filing complaints, following procedures, refusing to let bad actors coast on the assumption that no one will push back. I'd spent my career investigating drug trafficking organizations, and the people running those organizations all operated on the same fundamental calculation. They assumed most victims wouldn't report crimes, most witnesses wouldn't testify, most evidence wouldn't be properly documented. They were right often enough that the scheme worked until someone disrupted that calculation. Someone who had resources, knowledge, and willingness to fight. That's what I'd been at DFW Airport. Not a hero or a crusader, just someone who recognized a scam and had the tools to do something about it. The medication in my carry-on bag was the same prescription I'd been carrying for 6 years. The bottle was labeled with my name, the prescribing physician, the pharmacy information, everything exactly as it should be. The only difference was that now, when TSA officers saw controlled substances in passengers' bags, they knew there were consequences for abusing their authority. They knew that systems were in place to catch them if they tried. They knew someone was watching. And for travelers like Dorothy Hillman, that knowledge might mean the difference between receiving medical care and being victimized by the very people supposed to protect them. The flight to Los Angeles departed on time. I took my medication with water from a bottle I'd bought after security, felt the familiar easing of pain that let me function without constant distraction. Sitting in my seat, waiting for takeoff, I pulled out my phone and responded to Dorothy Hillman's letter. Told her that her words had meant more than she probably realized, that knowing the investigation had helped real people made the chaos of that morning worth it. I didn't tell her about missing the Atlanta testimony or the complications that had caused. That wasn't her burden to carry. Her letter had reminded me why the work mattered, why pushing back against corruption was worth the personal cost. That was enough. The plane lifted off, Dallas disappearing below us, and I closed my eyes and thought about all the flights I'd taken over the years, all the airports I'd passed through, carrying medication that let me do my job. I thought about Whitfield and Brennan, sitting in federal prison, probably still angry about being caught, probably still believing they'd just been unlucky to target the wrong passenger. They'd never understand that luck had nothing to do with it. They'd been caught because they'd built a system that relied on victims staying silent, and they'd finally encountered someone who wouldn't. Someone who'd spent 11 years investigating schemes exactly like theirs, who recognized the patterns, who had the resources and knowledge to fight back. The truth is that most corruption gets exposed not through dramatic whistleblowing or investigative journalism, but through small moments when someone refuses to accept abuse as normal. When someone documents what happened, makes the phone calls, files the complaints, follows through despite pressure to let it go. That's what had happened at DFW Airport. A small refusal to accept injustice that had cascaded into federal charges, prison sentences, and systematic reforms. The impact felt too large for such a small beginning, but that's how change usually works. Not through grand gestures, but through accumulated small acts of resistance against people who abuse power. 3 people were in federal prison because they'd assumed I'd be like every other passenger, rushed, intimidated, willing to accept their authority without question. They'd been wrong, and that miscalculation had cost them everything. I didn't feel triumphant about it, just satisfied that the system had worked the way it was supposed to, that evidence had led to accountability, that people who'd hurt others had faced consequences. The flight attendant came by with drinks, and I ordered coffee, black. Outside the window, clouds stretched to the horizon, brilliant white against blue sky. In a few hours, I'd be in Los Angeles, sitting in a conference room with agents from DEA, FBI, and local police, discussing strategies for disrupting fentanyl distribution networks that were killing thousands of Americans. The work would continue, the investigations would pile up, the cases would demand attention and resources. But I'd always remember the morning at DFW Airport when showing my DEA badge had transformed a routine security interaction into a federal investigation. When refusing to let 2 corrupt officers steal my medication had exposed a scheme that had victimized hundreds of travelers. The badge in my credentials case wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a reminder that power comes with responsibility, that knowledge creates obligation, that witnessing injustice without acting makes you complicit in it. I'd acted, and because of that choice, Dorothy Hillman and passengers like her were safer. That was the job, really. Not the investigations or arrests or court testimony, though those mattered, but the fundamental work of standing between vulnerable people and those who'd hurt them, of using authority to protect rather than exploit. Airport security had insisted my medication was contraband. Then they'd seen my DEA badge and everything changed. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.